Welcome everybody to movie discussion night with Wisconsin Veterans Museum for the month of April. Before we get started though, I just want to say thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support in all of our virtual programs that we do. Not only our movie discussion nights, but our book talks, our trivia nights, our drink and draw events. We got a lot of virtual events going on, have had since COVID lockdown, and we are continuing those. So thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support, with support for the foundation coming in the memory of Pat Finley. So as well, thank you to the Finley family for all that you do for the museum and for us in the education team. I just admitted Sally again. I don't know. I don't see her coming up. Okay. She'll come back. She knows where we're at. She knows what we're doing. Oh, yeah, there she is. Excellent. Sally, can you hear us? No, she's connecting to audio now. Excuse me. I hope everybody's having a good Friday night. Beautiful weather here in Madison today for once, and then we're going to get storms tomorrow. Sally, how are you? You're muted if you're talking to us. No. Well, anyway, we're going to go ahead and get moving along here. So for April, we are looking at, there she is. Hi, Sally. We're looking at the 2000 film Tigerland. This film was directed by Joel Schumacher, who's had kind of a hit or miss career, especially in the 80s and 90s with films like St. Elmo's Fire, Lost Boys. And then I don't know if anybody has seen the Michael Douglas film from 92, 93, I can't remember, called Falling Down. I think that's one of his finest films, but still, even that was kind of considered a flop. Like I said, he's kind of had a hit or miss career, ups and downs for him. Cinematography for Tigerland was done by Matthew Libatique. I had not heard of him before, but once I looked up his filmography, a lot of films that I am familiar with: Miracle at St. Anna, Cowboys and Aliens, and then most recently in 2022, The Whale with Brendan Fraser. So he's got quite a nice career behind the camera. And if you are interested in any of those films or looking up more about him, you can certainly find him online. I was quite impressed with his filmography once I started looking at him as a cinematographer. Tigerland stars Colin Farrell, one of my most, I guess, recent favorite actors, but not for the films that he's most widely known for. I like his independent European films like In Bruges and The Banshees of Inisherin. If you haven't seen any of those, I highly recommend them. But in this movie, he dons a Texas accent, pretty good for an Irishman, I thought. Also starring Matthew Davis as Private Paxton, Clifton Collins Jr. as Private Miter, and Shea Wiggum as Private Wilson. Although this movie was supposed to be set at Fort Polk, Louisiana, it was actually filmed just a few states east in Camp Blanding in Florida. But I thought it looked pretty close to Fort Polk. Produced by Regency Films, distributed by 20th Century Fox. And this last bit's kind of shocking. It had a budget of $10 million. I don't know where they spent that money at, because there wasn't a whole lot going on as far as, you know, the actors were all, this is all their first major films, mostly. The actors had no sort of trailers, makeup artists, anything like that. They all went pretty, au naturel. The lighting, the director used absolutely no external lighting on this film, and really shot it, as I noted in some of my questions, on a 16 millimeter handheld camera. So I'm not quite sure where they spent the 10 million bucks at. Unfortunately, though, for Joel Schumacher and for 20th Century Fox, its box office gross was less than $150,000. That number surprised me. I even had to look at a few different sites just to make sure that I had that number right. But for spending 10 million bucks and only grossing 150 or 150, less than 150,000, that's wow, that's outrageous. It really did not have a wide opening here in the U.S., much less anywhere else. Not quite sure what 20th Century Fox was doing with this, why they put so much money into it, and then why they just kind of let it fail, or at least fall to the wayside anyway. Um, so, we'll go around real quick and just get everybody's thoughts on the film. Lisa, we'll start with you. You're first up in my order. What did you think of the film?
I liked it.
Did you?
I liked it overall.
Okay. Chris?
Yeah, I liked it too. This was the second time I'd seen it. I still kind of find it hard to, the Colin Farrell character, Boz, still find kind of hard to believe would have gotten away with that kind of crap, even at the height of in Vietnam, where they were taking basically anybody at that point.
Yeah. We lost George. I don't know if he'll be back or not. Sally, what did you think of the film?
I did not care for this movie at all. It was way, way over the top to me on the absurd, but I've never been in the military, and I know it's the Vietnam era and they did a lot of crazy stuff then, but I agree with Chris. That Boz character was just like totally unbelievable to me.
Yeah.
It
there was quite a few points.
Just kind of ruined the whole movie for me.
Did it?
Yeah.
Well, I agree with both you and Chris on the fact that this Boz character. I even during the Vietnam era, when you're literally taking anybody you can get, especially I think this was supposed to be what, 68, somewhere in there.
71, I think.
71. Okay. This is the stuff that he was getting away with and doing, and
Yeah.
And the opening scene, he's coming out of the stockade. So he's obviously been in trouble before, but just the way he talks to his superiors, his actions, the whole time I'm sitting there going, okay, when is this guy going to get in trouble again? And I wanted to like the film. I'm not so sure that I did because of that aspect, Sally. But also, and maybe you guys can help me out here. I just didn't really see a point to the film.
Okay, that's what I wondered. What is he trying to get across to us? Yeah, basic training sucks. We know that. Going to Nam sucks. But I just didn't get the point of the movie.
No,
I don't know what he was trying to achieve.
I think the part that got me wasn't so much Boz, but it was and I can completely see that point of it. But for me, it was the lack of standards on the other side, that like, just for one example, is that Wilson guy coming back when he was completely scary out of line. And there were multiple times in that where people overstepped their bounds. And I've seen, I haven't been in it, but I've seen like gunny sergeants up close, pressing people and stuff. And it's uncomfortable, but they really, to me, crossed the line a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, there were several points in the film. I'm just like, how is this guy not back in the stockade or kicked out? Talking about Boz, and then you're right, Wilson as well. After he commits that terrible act, they just kind of recycle him through to another company, and I was just like, really? Okay.
When I was in basic training, this would have been in the fall of 1969. We had a guy in my unit, my barracks, who had kind of the attitude of Boz, but he wasn't anything like Boz. He wasn't. He didn't confront anybody. I sort of think of him as sort of like he was a happy cynic. He was really cynical about everything, but he had a smile. But he wasn't out there to help somebody get out of the service or anything like that. He was not. He was not challenging anybody. He was just going along. He'd been drafted, but he was. He disagreed with everything, but he wasn't going to fight it the way Boz did. The other thing that struck me, and in terms of how over the top this was, once again, I'll refer to the Blu-ray version of this with the extras. They had a section on there about the real Tigerland, and what it consisted of was interviews with soldiers who had gone through the basic training and then into Tigerland. And one of the drill sergeants who had been training them, and it sounds like it was even worse than what we saw in the movie from their description of it. And so it kind of gave me a little bit of a different perspective on it. I mean, the first time I saw it, I thought this is way over the top, but but that extra in the Blu-ray suggests that the training that they got in basic training at Fort Polk, which they called Fort Puke, was and then at the AIT and ultimately the final week in Tigerland, they said that that the Tigerland portion of their training was live fire, and that there were a lot of people who got hurt during that. So I mean, as over the top as this might have seemed, I'm not sure. I think it was probably even less over the top than what those folks experienced. And they did say that in that extra that there were a lot of guys that you know, mentally just collapsed as a result of the training they were going through. So that the character of Wilson and Miter weren't really, in a sense, perhaps out of the ordinary for that.
Yeah, and I could see that, especially, you know, like, and they hit this point so many times, you know, this is your last stop before you're shipped off to Vietnam. And, you know, the war had already been going on for a while now. So, you know, they really had a good idea of what to expect and how to train these troops. And so I can imagine absolutely, Chris, that going through Tigerland in real life was quite an experience. And not an easy one, I can imagine, not at all.
The one thing that I thought was so over the top that I found unbelievable was how Wilson would have gotten a hold of live ammo, given how that stuff is really controlled, particularly in the training situation.
Yeah, you know, and it's supposed to be, you know, you're right, it's supposed to be really tightly controlled. I know when I was in basic training, you know, this is later. This is, you know, 90, or sorry, yeah, 90. I don't want to say that we probably could have swiped a few live rounds, but we probably could have swiped a few live rounds. You know, when you're having to account for, you know, 1,500 individual bullets, it's kind of easy to miss, you know, maybe a few here or there. But it's still, it's not something that happens all the time. And there are, you know, checks and balances in place to make sure that that sort of thing doesn't happen.
Well, for somebody who was a trainee to be able to get a hold of that, I think would have been highly unlikely. Maybe in the situation that you were in. I don't know if you were talking about when you were in Iraq or whatever.
No, this would have been at Fort Knox.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. George, welcome back. So you got kicked off for a minute, but you're back now. First thing we do is we kind of go through and see what everybody thought of the film overall. What was your impression of the film, George?
Well, actually, I joined when I heard about this because I had seen that film probably around the time it first came out and liked it a great deal. I'm not a veteran, but I was around that age of 20 years old when during the period where the movie takes place. And it made me think of while I was, you know, going to school and having fun with some of my friends, other of our friends were Vietnam bound. And also during the period that's depicted here, nearing the end of the war, it was a particularly interesting period. It was, and the movie depicted realistically, or through the character, Colin Farrell's character, and some of the other aspects there, the racial tensions, etc., the breakdown of morale and effectiveness that the Army was experiencing at that time, and only accelerated since then, which was one of the reasons why I think the government decided, you know, they had to end it, among other reasons, end the war.
Yeah, this is,
other than that,
this is really the first war that was in your living room every night.
Yeah, absolutely.
And did, you know, the news crew, CBS and NBC and ABC, they didn't pull any punches. You know, so they were really letting the American people know what was going on over there. And after a few years of that, you know, you're absolutely right. People just don't want to go into this meat grinder anymore. And so, yeah, morale was low, most definitely. And like you said, probably for good reason. And one of the first questions I asked everybody to kind of compare and contrast the two characters of Boz and Paxton, but compare and contrast them from a point of being a draftee and a volunteer. And how do you go about putting those sorts of people together and still looking to achieve the same outcome out of each individual?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it was a good, I don't know if, I'm not a film critic, a film buff, but not a critic, but I think that was a very, part of the narrative device where they became buddies. Paxton being the more, even he says, I want to be like Hemingway or a writer about it. So that device, here's some guy who's, taking it all in, the observer in a way. And then the Colin Farrell character, Boz, who is in the middle of it, and he's a very interesting character who, who doesn't say he's the sensitive one, who you would think would be the writer or the person with ambitions of being writer. He's more of in a sense, a tough guy. But he's the one with the most empathy.
It does start to turn out that way. You're right. And before we jump onto that line of empathy and Boz and kind of how his character surprises us along the way in certain situations, does anybody want to chime in on the difference between Boz and Paxton, one being a volunteer, the other being drafted?
I didn't. I watched the movie and then I read the questions, and I didn't feel something pulling on that. I mean, I realized that there was one who chose to be there, but it didn't stand out to me. It was more their relationship, and that they kind of were able to form a relationship despite that.
Yeah, and I think you're right with that, Lisa. I kind of got the same thing. I still wanted to ask the question. I wanted to look at both sides, but I didn't feel that there was glaring differences between the two. Based on one volunteering, the other being drafted. There was glaring differences in other aspects of their characters, but I don't think it was necessarily through that particular source of coming into the military.
I thought the big difference with among the characters was mainly that both Boz and Paxton had been to college, and none of the others had, apparently.
Wow.
And
did I miss that? Did Boz was a college student?
he had 1 year.
I must have missed that.
And then I think he said he dropped out or he was kicked out or something like that. But yeah, they were the two that had some college education, and then you wind up with who was it, Miter, I think it was, who had dropped out in 6th grade or something like that. So you got that spread, but that I thought was the big divide between Paxton and Boz on one hand, and everybody else, including the drill sergeants and so on in the movie. And I think that was part of the thing that created a bond between Boz and Paxton, was that they had this in a sense more intellectual outlook on life than some of the others. The others seemed to, I mean, it's not that it was wrong. It would be wrong not to have an intellectual approach, but the others had in a sense a more street level kind of intelligence about life, and then you have Paxton and Boz on the other hand. Boz seemed to be I thought he was kind of the bridge between the two, because he was there empathizing with the guys who had the hard life. Paxton didn't seem to have a connection really with them, but Boz seemed to be able to connect on both ends.
Yeah, Paxton kind of struck me as, and they never really said as much, but he kind of struck me as maybe he was kind of a rich kid.
Yeah.
You know, sort of like Charlie Sheen's character in Platoon, altruistic, wanting to go out there and get an experience that you're not going to get at any other point in your life, probably. And maybe not even realizing, how real dangerous this experience is going to be. But
Okay.
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I kind of sympathize with Paxton, or empathize with him, because his attitude partly was, I have an obligation to go, even though I could get out of it. And that was sort of the way I felt when I enlisted. I mean, I could have stayed in college, but there was just something about what was happening at that time that I didn't feel comfortable with, sort of, in a sense, hiding out. And so I withdrew from college at the end of my first year, and my best friend and I in high school enlisted together. So when Paxton was kind of explaining why he was there, I was thinking, yeah, I get it.
Yeah, I think that was a very common sentiment among people at that time.
Yeah,
It's
much like we would see after September 11th, right?
Yeah. So
this feeling of
you want some real threads of feeling of that people had at that time, and kind of express that through these characters.
So
from him.
Kind of going back to Boz and what George said, with his empathy, that is one thing that I found throughout the film, was that he kept surprising me, particularly with that soliloquy by Cantwell when they're peeling potatoes, and he's talking about, how same moon that we're under right now is the same moon my wife and kids are under, and it's the same moon that the guys who are dying in Vietnam is under. And Boz is like, God, what do you know? You're not supposed to make me cry. What's wrong with you? What's going on? He just kept having moments like that. Did you guys feel that kind of that expression coming from Boz?
That seemed like a breakthrough moment. That was the first scene of that, and it came through strong. And
strong, yeah.
It started, the ball rolling for him to help, those who he could.
Yeah, because he turns right around and right after that, and he helps Cantwell get out, and then it's not too much longer. He's coaching Miter how to get out. I just kept being surprised by, you got this tough guy who's maybe he's even starting to find out these things about himself as they're going through. Maybe he didn't even realize that he cared, as much as he ended up seeming to care.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say the thing, the sort of the cynicism about him that struck me was in one of the early scenes. You see him there in the Deuce and a Half, and he's reading Johnny Got His Gun, which is one of the big anti-war novels by Dalton Trumbo.
And I got to say, I didn't find out about that until after I'd watched the film a couple times. I am a huge Dalton Trumbo fan. I love his whole story, and to find out that's what he was reading just made me so happy.
Well, he's on the Deuce reading it, and they're mocking him for it and so on. And I read Johnny Got His Gun years and years ago, and it's really a terrific book. And one of these days I'm going to watch the movie too. But in any event, later on, when I think it's Paxton gives him the book back, he said, he says, have you read it? And Boz says, no, I just hang on to it to piss him off. and that was sort of the cynical side of him, which I think, with that scene when they're doing the potatoes, sort of you say is sort of that transition point where you start to see him being more and more sympathetic with everybody, and the cynicism, even though his attitude towards what's going on doesn't really change. The sort of cynicism about it has sort of been worn away, I think.
I think earlier when Sally said she didn't see a purpose to the movie, what was the purpose? I think for me, and you bringing up this question, I think it's the empathy of this character that it is throughout the movie, and it's that's kind of the focus that even with all of this crap that's going on and the intensity of it, and you're gonna die, you're all gonna go there and die, and here's this person standing up for everyone throughout the movie. I think that was kind of the purpose, and you could see it in his you know, he stood back and watched things and then went and got involved. He saw things as they started to happen and then inserted himself to stand up for the underdog. And yeah, I appreciated that about the character, and I kind of think that was maybe an intention of the movie.
And while I get that, Lisa, when you're in basic training, you know, and like you said, and Sally said, and George said as well, you guys didn't serve, but you still got a really good concept, a really good grasp of what it all means. Should privates who are going through basic training, particularly at wartime, should they be standing up for the underdog? Is that their place?
That's where my part was, what I said when I first started. I thought that the people in charge, like, I understand that it's supposed to be badass. I understand they're supposed to break you down and build you back up. And what did they say at the beginning? You're going to take all these and make them one. But I do think that that there were a lot of superior people who overstepped the bounds. I really felt that there was a lot of, and that makes me uncomfortable when I see that. And at first I wasn't liking the movie because it feels trapping. It feels like, you know, there's no justice here. There's people just doing what they want, and there's no justice. There's no standard. And that makes me really uncomfortable. So at first I was like, oh, I don't even know if I can get through this, because that kind of stuff, because I tend to have a very empathetic personality. So then when I see that they're in a place of extreme injustice, it makes me uncomfortable.
Fair enough.
I think, Eric, your question about trainees or you know, enlisted privates standing up for the underdog. I think that's part of what the basic training was about, because it was always, you got to bring the least of yours along with you. I remember in basic training, we had a guy in there. He was probably in the worst physical condition I've seen of anybody I've ever met. He was a pure intellectual. He had a PhD from MIT. You're going, what the hell is he doing here? I mean, he had no physical abilities at all. We had this low, I don't know if they still did it when you were in, Eric, but we had this low crawl training that we had to do. You crawl along on a mat, 20 yards down, 20 yards back, and you're timed on the whole thing. And I think that the timing was, you had to do it in like about 20 or 30 seconds. This guy, his name was Scudo. I can still remember him. He took, I think the first time he did it, it took him like 3 minutes to do that crawl.
Wow.
And so literally the entire platoon was there throughout basic, was constantly working with him to try to get him up to the standards, because we were basically being in a sense punished for whoever the least of our comrades was. And he was physically he was the least, so we had to drag him along, and he eventually did it. I mean, he actually, by the end of the whole thing, it worked out for him. And fortunately for him, this is one of the times the Army made the right decision. They sent him, I think, to the Pentagon to work in DARPA or something like that. But it was.
But your platoon, they were supportive of him. They built him up, and they tried their best to.
Well, I mean, he wasn't somebody that you felt bad if you were mocking him. I mean, that was the thing. He was like, you know, I don't know exactly how to describe it, but he was like the kid that, you know, you didn't want to be, he'd probably been bullied all his life. You weren't going to bully him some more.
But see, that makes me feel bad, because we had a kid in a similar position when I was going through basic training, and we isolated him.
Oh,
You know, he was just a constant, you know, ball and chain around our legs. And, you know, I don't know, think of me what you will, but, you know, we isolated him. We didn't try to help him. And he eventually got sectioned out. And when he was sectioned out, the day before he left, drill sergeant brought the whole company together, and they stood him up on a loading dock, and they gave him the riot act right there in front of everybody. And then, you know, your parting gift is now you're being discharged.
well,
And so it's just surprising, especially during that period. I would have expected it to be the opposite. I would have expected similar actions, but to hear you say that you guys worked with them and you were supportive of them and you tried to help them, that kind of surprises me a bit.
well, we certainly didn't. I mean, there may have been people who did, who wanted to do that. I don't know. But I thought the drill sergeants, the drill sergeants just kept pushing him and pushing him and pushing him to do better. And basically the message we got was, you got to push him too. I mean, they were desperate for bodies, let's put it, not to put it too bluntly. And so they were trying to get everybody through that they could get through. And so if we had tried to, you know, try to isolate him, I think the drill sergeants would have basically said, you can't do that. You're a team. You've got to make him part of your team. You've got to be, not let him fall behind, not let him fail.
And you know, that's the right answer. You know, especially when you're gonna, you know, stand a very good possibility of being shipped out to a combat zone. You know, these are the guys that are going to be in a foxhole with you, and the right answer is to help them build them up. And I didn't include this question in the discussion questions I sent out, but I did make it in my notes. And Lisa brings up a good point. And I'm curious, is this, as we're trying to figure out, at least Sally and I anyway, what this movie is really about? Is this movie really about just a single man, Boz, or is there a greater scenario going on here?
I think to a certain extent.
No, go ahead.
No, I'm going to say to a certain extent, I think it was about what the circumstances do to people in those circumstances. I mean, and how various people will react, and we saw a range of reactions. I mean, the scene on the Deuce and a Half where I think it was Wilson calls one of the guys a nigger.
Yeah.
And the whole thing just explodes. I mean, and you see the prejudices, you see the empathy, you see the cynicism, you see the hatreds, all caught up in this one bundle. And the question is, given the circumstances everybody has been put into, how are they going to respond given their characteristics?
Yeah, and if that would, along that line, would want to make a comment related to something that Lisa brought up about how the atmosphere of the soldiers there was one of entrapped in an unjust environment. And this movie always, when I first saw it and then when I watched it again today, brought to my mind, and I think it has a lot, it is maybe from my viewing, its main point, and that is, in a sense, a portrait. The movie it brings to my mind is Cool Hand Luke, and it's a portrait of a rebel, and which is also brought out about Boz. He's a natural leader, but he's a rebel. That's kind of a complex thing.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of American character, a very individual who wants to go his own way, and yet he kind of gets put in a leadership, and in this case, somebody who's a savior
a couple different
some of these people who are trapped in this environment. And that's my takeaway, macro takeaway of the film. Although something that just came to my mind in this discussion is also another book and film that comes to mind is Catch-22.
You brought
An
that
environment where
several times.
you're constantly being told you're going to die, you're going to die, you're going to die. The sane thing to do is escape.
Yeah.
Which is what a lot of this movie is about. How do I get out of this, fatal, dangerous situation as an individual? And that conflicts with patriotism, duty, and all that stuff. And that's a very Vietnam era, like the book Catch-22. Cool, this Johnny got his gun tension between duty and surviving. So that's kind of my overall view of the movie.
So what I'm hearing is maybe this movie's a lot more philosophical than what appears on the surface.
I think
George,
so.
like you said, self-preservation is something that we all hold dear. At what point do you put away self-preservation for the greater good? And maybe that's the overall point of the film. Boz does, rather than, and he even calls himself, what does he say? He calls himself a failed fool because he hasn't been able to secure his release yet, but he's got a couple of other guys out already. And so he's looking at himself as, this is my ultimate goal, is to get out. And I've helped other people get out, but I'm still here.
Yeah, that's ironic. Irony.
It's funny when he called himself a failed fool.
Yeah.
But he's still going along this path that he set before him. And like a couple of you have already mentioned, his leadership styles, his leadership traits do start to come out. He's made platoon leader. And then he even has a chance to escape toward the end of the film. But rather than do that, he comes back to basically look over Paxton and make sure that Wilson, doesn't pull any of his stunts. And then of course, shooting his rifle right off up near Paxton's eye, to secure his discharge. He is putting away self-preservation for the greater good. It just kind of accumulates over the course of the film.
He's an odd sort of saint.
That's a good way of putting it.
He saves these other people, maybe at the cost of himself, because at the end he's on the bus to go to Vietnam. From the first minutes of the film, he's trying to get out of it.
Yeah.
These other people, he managed to help them get out, and he's going. So that's even a sacrificial aspect to sainthood in a sense. I might be stretching these things a little bit, but that's kind of how a lot of these film critiques are. Yeah.
I thought that to a certain extent that the what he did with Miter, with Paxton, that in getting these guys out, they were kind of proxies for him getting out. That he couldn't bring himself to do it himself for himself, but he had no qualms about doing what he could for others to get out. And so that was his way of sort of, if he couldn't get out, if he couldn't bring himself to get out, he was damn sure going to help others get out.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a saintly thing to do, isn't it? We've been talking a lot about Boz, and as I was coming up with my questions, that's why I asked, is this film just about a single man? Because all of my notes for like the first, 3/4 of the film were all about Boz. But there are other characters, and so I wanted to bring some of those in too, particularly Miter. Miter is the first platoon leader that we see. He seems to struggle a little bit in his leadership role, and eventually kind of breaks down. But really, at the heart of it, why was he not able to maintain that position as platoon leader and be successful at it? What was his major the obstacles, you know, that he just couldn't get over?
He didn't have any confidence from
Yeah.
the very beginning. When they assigned him the job, you could tell he didn't have confidence, and he wanted to do it as if he could find this confidence within him and he could be this leader, but he just didn't have there's that it factor of leadership, and he didn't have any of it. And the other guys saw that from the beginning, as you could hear the mocking little comments and everything. And there was nothing that he had, any asset that he had. Whereas like Boz, he had an integrity. He had a fight that he would go, even though he was foolish, he would, you know, these characteristics would come out and they were admirable. And that's what started selling the people on him. He never really did anything wrong to anybody else, really. He was just screwing up on himself. And yes, and sometimes that would cause extra for people, and he didn't like that. But yeah, so I just don't think Miter had any leadership skill at all.
I think the lack of confidence showed up when he actually collapsed in the latrine with Boz there, and you get a sense of who he was, and it was just really clear to me anyway that as Lisa said, he just didn't have that confidence that you need to be a leader, and I sort of got that sense that he was trying to emulate what he saw in the drill sergeants by being tough and you know, kind of bullying people, but he didn't have the characteristic necessary to be an effective bully even. And they saw that. When I was in, one of the odd things was it kind of reminded me of the flip side that I saw when I was in Officer Candidate School at Fort Sill. We had a guy come into our class when we were all assembling initially. He'd been a Green Beret in Vietnam, a couple of tours, and he just oozed this leadership quality. But he was not a screamer. He wasn't a yeller. It was just this confidence that he had about him. And the irony was that they were going to try to post him out of the program because he didn't yell enough. And we're all going, "What the hell is this all about?" I mean, that was the problem with the leadership during that period. I've told people that my experience in the OCS program, which I did not finish, so I don't want to make myself out, you know, like I got through that whole thing. I eventually got my commission through the National Guard, but the officer candidate program at Fort Sill was perhaps the worst example of leadership training that I've ever seen. I mean, it was absolutely awful. And when they sent at that time, they were doing a review of all the Army training from the top to the bottom, you know, Army War College down to basic training. They sent an evaluation team out to Fort Sill. It was headed by a 3-star general whose son had gone through Fort Sill OCS and had died in Vietnam. He came through, and at the end of his evaluation, he literally relieved the entire staff except for a few TAC officers because the training had been so poor. And that's what I thought all the time I was there. So I felt kind of vindicated. But that was what, as I was watching this movie, what I saw in Miter was the consequences of really poor leadership. And it was kind of alluded to when Paxton, I think it was Paxton, made some reference to My Lai during this. What is this like? Is this going to be like My Lai?
Right, yeah.
Which had just, you know, in 1970, Seymour Hersh had just, you know, revealed that in 1969. So it was fairly fresh at that point. And and My Lai was an example of, you know, bad leadership. I mean, yeah. with Cali. I mean, he was a terrible leader, but he'd gotten through OCS.
Maybe he just yelled a lot.
Yeah, I'm sure that's what got him through.
Yeah, one thing that the movie seems to address or portray is a lot of dysfunction in the Army at that time. the fact that Meter is chosen and appointed who doesn't have leadership capabilities, but he's made that, and they don't recognize, well, at some point they do recognize it in Boz, but that's sort of a different subject. Although I did, as an aside, I wanted to bring up that since you mentioned Fort Sill, in 1964, as a 12-year-old, my folks shipped me off to spend the summer with an aunt and uncle who lived on Fort Sill. My uncle was a career Army. And it was one of the most interesting summers of my life.
Yeah, Lawton, Oklahoma.
Yeah, Lawton, yeah. And some of that, not that I saw the same scenes, but those base towns are pretty interesting. They're not exactly Southern California suburbia.
No, by a long shot.
Which was interesting as a 12-year-old.
Yeah, Colleen and Fort Hood, you know.
Yeah. And not to mention Oklahoma weather.
Yeah, no kidding.
But anyway, that's my Fort Sill story.
Another thing I wanted to bring up as time's starting to run down, and Chris and George and possibly Sally too, maybe you guys could speak about this, more than Lisa or I. The racial tension that is shown in the film. How we've seen this in other films before, but it just kind of struck me that this one, the tension that we see in this film, it just felt different. And I'm just curious, how close was it, to maybe the real deal back then? How well did they hit the mark on that?
Oh, I think if you've read anything about the Army in that period, I mean, I don't have direct experience. It was a big problem. I mean, you've heard the term fracking.
Yeah.
Well, who do you think was doing most of that fracking? And that's a lot more serious than a little brawl.
Yeah.
I had, my best friend, and his twin brother went into the Army 1970, about that time, although since they enlisted, they somehow went to Germany, didn't have to go to Vietnam. Mm-hmm. One of the things, they were very interesting things they said when they came back, he said, where they were, in spite of the prevalence of drug addiction among the rank and file in the Army, it was basically a three-way war off base. The blacks versus the whites versus the Germans. Mm. And I had another friend who was in Vietnam, and he is white, and he said when they would be in base just hanging out, what they hated, and we were driving around one time, and the song from that period, Shaft by Isaac Hayes, mm-hmm. It was on the radio, and he, this was after he had come at home, and he said, God, I hate that song. Because we'd be sitting around our barracks, and by the third time that we heard that song, all the black guys armed with clubs were breaking into our, it was a rumble. So it was a very, very big thing at that time. And it just reflected what was going on in the United States at the same time, mm-hmm. which was a lot. So this was actually kind of it hinted at it compared to what I think the reality was.
I think when I was in basic training, the thing that was kind of interesting was that I think we had some black drill sergeants, and they were actually harder on the black trainees than they were on us. Mm-hmm. And I think my sense is that was because they knew what these black trainees were going to be facing, mm-hmm. and they had to toughen them up. Mm-hmm. That as tough as it might have been on the outside in the civilian world, it was going to be even tougher on the inside in the military. And I mean, it wasn't the drill sergeants that we had weren't beating on us like they did in this movie. I mean, if they'd gotten out of control like that, they would have been tossed. I don't have any doubt about that. But they drove us hard. But they drove some of the black soldiers even harder. And there was one guy in particular, one black guy, a trainee who was just kind of a screw up. I mean, and they really rode him. I remember one time he was screwing around, and we were out on the range, and one of the drill sergeants grabbed him and said, "Climb that tree." He said, so he climbed the tree. He said, "Now shout out, keep shouting out, I'm a shitbird. I'm a shitbird." And we all stood around watching. You know, that was the tensions were there. I didn't see them as much in the units I was in, but I know that they were out there. On that extra on the Blu-ray that I was talking about, so they were talking about what it was like. One of the guys was saying, he was a white guy, was saying the problem that I had was that I was from New York, and these drill sergeants were all Southerners, and they hated people from New York.
For sure.
Yeah.
So there was, and I think a lot of the regionalism was actually a bigger problem in many respects than the racial issues, at least in basic at that point.
And I can see that, you know, and you know, we do read about it, we do hear about it, you know, what the racial tensions were back then. When you look at, you know, instances like the Kitty Hawk race riots on board the USS Kitty Hawk, you know, here's this aircraft carrier, and you know, for 3 days, you had race riots going on, and not a single white person was brought to trial for those, not a single one. And so, you know, this is clearly systemic throughout the military itself. But like I said, it just something, and I can't put my finger on it, but something about how it was portrayed in this movie just felt different than, you know, what we see in other movies. You know, like Full Metal Jacket, we're going to watch that one in June. And, you know, there's a lot of racial stuff that goes on in the second half of that film. And other movies as well that we've seen or we're going to see, particularly this year as we're looking at, you know, 50 years removed from Vietnam. But it's just something about this film, it just felt different to me. And I was just curious, you know, for those of you that, you know, I wasn't even born, Chris, when you were going to basic training in OCS. So, you know, I was just
You're just a young'un.
Yeah, yeah.
I wanted to make something about what George said about the guys, some people he knew who enlisted and wound up in Germany. One of the points about enlisting, because I could have, when I dropped out, I could have waited to be drafted. One of the things about enlisting was you had a certain degree of freedom to choose what military MOS you wanted. And so presumably if you didn't want to go to Vietnam, or if you were going to go to Vietnam, you might not have wanted to go to as an infantryman. It would say the 11 Bravo or 11 Bullet Stopper. I mean, I chose stock control and accounting when I went in, because I figured if I'm going to go over, at least I might be in the back, I might be in the rear echelon, you know, handing out the bullets rather than out front trying to stop them.
Sure.
So these folks that enlisted and wound up in Germany might have enlisted for one of those specialties that would send you to a place like Germany.
Yeah, I think they were both truck drivers, which I don't necessarily think would. I'm sure they needed truck drivers in Vietnam too, but somehow it turned out that if they enlisted, their chances of going to Vietnam were going to be less, and it turned out that they didn't have to go. They ended up with a European vacation instead.
Yeah,
well,
that's what happened to my dad. My dad enlisted and he got assigned to Germany, and that's why I was born in Germany. But yeah, I think you're both right. If you do enlist rather than get drafted, there's a few more options available to you, and if you play your cards right, those options will keep you out of the conflict for sure.
Yeah. On the other hand, stories of early on, before there was they stopped the draft and had the lottery, you could get a student deferment, and I had friends who they would drop PE class and lose half a unit and lose their deferment. Within weeks they were drafted. And within a month they were Vietnam.
Right away.
You know, so if with the irony of that, you could enlist and avoid it, and flunk out of a class and end up there. I think that's why there was so much dissatisfaction with things, the way the system was run.
I just want to make one more point tangentially about whether this was over the top in terms of portraying Tigerland. On the Blu-ray, one of the extras, they mentioned that the soldiers that went through Fort Polk and through Tigerland, they had the lowest, I guess, percentage of soldiers who were killed or wounded in Vietnam, and had the highest percentage of troops that came back alive. So apparently that was the point that they were making in the that those enlisted guys and the drill sergeant that were doing the interviews said that the point was to prepare them as best as possible based on their experience for surviving in Vietnam. And apparently it was successful, as over the top as it might have seemed.
Like we always said, you train like you fight. And if you don't train like you fight, you're not coming back. When we went to Desert Storm, I mean, we trained for, I can't even tell you how long. And by the time we finally got into action, none of us had any fear. We all knew our jobs. We knew everybody else's jobs. We knew what we were supposed to do. And we all came back. Not to try to equate Desert Storm with Vietnam, because there's no equating those two conflicts at all. But yeah, you train like you fight. And if you do have successful training, especially when it becomes super tough and you can make it through that, you're like you said, you got a good chance of making it through the conflict itself. And I hope that's still the way they're doing, not just the Army, but the Marines and the Air Force and everybody else today. Maybe not today, maybe 10 years ago when we were still in Afghanistan and still in Iraq. But that's just, in my mind, that's the way training should be. That's why you're there.
Ironically, apparently at the time of Vietnam, Tigerland was actually on the cutting edge of experimentation about how to train troops. This was very unusual, and they were constantly adapting and learning new things as they went along. And it got better and better as the war progressed, if you can call that getting better.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, we hadn't fought in that kind of a conflict in that type of environment since, I guess the Philippine American War at the turn of the century. Everything else was Europe based. Well, no, I guess in World War II campaign in the Pacific, the Pacific campaign. Yeah, you're fighting in those kinds of conditions too, and against a pretty brutal enemy in the Japanese. No, yeah, I can see that.
So one thing I'm getting from what you're just saying, what both of you are talking about now, that this film, in a way, is not really an accurate description of the actual Tigerland and its effectiveness. It kind of uses that Tigerland maybe as a metaphor for the Vietnam War in general. And not to take it, as a documentary.
Yeah, no, and
it is a film.
Particularly with the way they shot the film. Like I said, 16 millimeter handheld camera, no external lighting, no makeup. It could very much come off as sort of a documentary style, film. But I mean, and Chris, you got a lot more information with your Blu-rays, but yeah, this was not wholly representative of what was going on over there.
It was somewhat unfair the way it showed it. Would you go so far as to say that?
No, it's Hollywood. I really don't think you could say unfair. At the end of the day, it's supposed to be entertainment. So I'm not going to come down on Hollywood and say that they're being unfair in their portrayal. maybe taking some liberties, perhaps, but I wouldn't say unfair.
Okay. That's
Time
interesting.
is just about up. My last question, I ask this of everybody every month. Who was your favorite character and why? Lisa, once again, you are still first up on my list, so we'll go with you.
All right. I usually try to find somebody outside the box, but I'm going to have to go with Boz because I really thought he did. I thought he did a good job, Colin Farrell. I guess this was one of it was his first big role.
Yeah, his first major motion picture role. Yeah.
And I thought that, like, I really liked, well, I don't like it, but I really appreciated the anguish that he had when somebody would start telling him a story that was about their life or something, and he would just, you could see it on his face. And it's like, oh crap, now I'm gonna have to help this person, or I thought somewhere in the story they were gonna bring up what happened to him, that there was something that happened to him early in life or something, and why he was so empathetic. But it's mine is Boz. And just one quick comment about the race. It's not actually about race, but I thought the main African American guy, I thought it was interesting. His name was Johnson. It seems like they always give the black guys like Johnson or Jackson or something like that. So it's like, really? Come on. Yeah,
it was kind of stereotypical, wasn't it? And I totally agree with you. I would have liked to have seen some sort of backstory on Boz. Yeah, I think that might have made the film just a little bit better for me.
Yeah.
Maybe not, but it would have been nice to see. Chris, how about you?
I don't know about a favorite character, but I think Boz was the indispensable character.
Oh, sure.
And so when you have a movie that's built around an indispensable character, I have to go with that person as as sort of my favorite, because I can't imagine the movie without that character. I also thought it was interesting that they had the name Boz, which seemed awfully close to boss.
Yeah, and it's not a very common last name.
Yeah,
not at all.
Also, you mentioned his Texas accent. In the Blu-ray extras, they interview him, and he has the Irish accent.
Oh, and so, no, he's very much from Ireland. If you watch In Bruges or Banshees of Inisherin, there's parts where I don't even know what he's saying, because his regular speaking voice, that Irish accent is just so thick, and it's like, I need to rewind that because I don't know what he said right now.
I thought it was remarkable how well he was able to take on that accent. I mean, the voice coaching was. I mean, if you had to give an Oscar for something, I'd give an Oscar for voice coaching that one.
But and interestingly enough, he only had a couple phone meetings with his voice coach, but he did take, I think, 2 or 3 weeks, and he just drove through Texas and just talked to people. And that's how he got the majority of that accent down, was just by immersing himself in the culture of Texas.
Well, that's about how long it takes to drive across Texas.
He in the movies I've seen him, other than In Bruges, and I have not seen the Banshees movie. He seems to do a terrific job in being able to suppress that accent. I mean, in Total Recall, the remake of Total Recall, I mean, you have no idea that he has that accent at all.
The Minority Report too, with Tom Cruise. Yeah. Sally, how about you? Who's your favorite character?
I like Paxton, the writer. I liked his narration, and I liked he was like a softie, and I liked the softies, so I liked him.
And then lastly, George, how about you, sir?
Well, I'm gonna have to go with Boz too. Well, as you said, he is the indispensable character. It is his movie, but the being of one of the, if not the first, the early, very early leading role with Colin Farrell, you really see the star quality, and which developed over the next 20 some years. Although I was surprised with Michael Shannon showing up in this movie,
Yeah.
and thinking of, his subsequent career too. And most of the other actors in there, I think the guy who played Wilson has been in a lot of things.
Yeah,
But most
Shea
of
Whigham,
the
yeah,
other
he's been in quite a
actors,
few films.
I don't recall from too many other movies. But anyway, in terms of character, yeah, I mean, in many ways, this movie is a character study of these various
for sure.
people, where Tigerland is just the environment they're in, and it's very stressful. So that allows those character traits to really be exposed. But anyway, that was my view.
I spent a lot of,
Oh, go ahead, Chris.
I was gonna say, I spent a lot of the movie trying to figure out where I'd seen the actor that played Wilson before. It was just driving me nuts. And I finally, so I went and I checked his filmography, and then I realized the most recent thing I'd seen him in was Kong Skull Island.
Yeah. Yeah, Shea Whigham has been in quite a lot of films. As I was going through and looking at the different actors who were in this film, the one who I think has the longest filmography, and who's been acting in Hollywood, longer than anybody that was in this film, was Miter, Clifton Collins Jr. His filmography is just enormous. I was shocked, and it's like, oh yeah, I do remember him from that. Oh yeah, I remember him from that film too. And they're not huge roles, but he has been. If I'm not mistaken, it's well over 100 movies that Miter has been in.
Wow.
Yeah. Like I said, Colin Farrell has slowly become, over the past 10 years or so, one of my favorite actors. His eyebrows just really pissed me off. I wanted to shave his eyebrows, and maybe that's why I didn't like him for so long when he first started acting. But he's really endeared himself to me, and I think and watching this, Tigerland, I could see why people have been pegging him as an A-list actor, since 2000. But my favorite character in the movie was Paxton as well, Sally. I liked him. I liked his narration, just like you did. I liked his character. Something about maybe it was just so fresh for this film. Everybody else was kind of dark. The whole film itself was a little dark. But whenever Paxton came on, it just seemed fresh, and like there was, I don't want to say like a glow around him, but he always just, I don't know what it is, but I really liked his on-screen presence. So I'm gonna have to go with Paxton myself.
He was kind of like the Billy Budd character.
Yeah, kind of.
He does. He does serve as sort of the moral center, as of the film, or someone who is, a little more decent.
Okay.
Decent as a character, and so I think naturally drawn to that, and centered the film, or gave it a little, kept it from being only a dark view of things.
Yeah, I would agree on that. Yeah, he was kind of like he was just like the beacon, the light that shined through, and that's where everybody kind of went toward. Next month for May, we're going to be watching Three Kings, Iraq War film, Desert Storm rather. I can't. Oh God, he is literally like one of my top 3 actors, and George Clooney. Yes, with George Clooney.
Yeah, I was going to say George Clooney.
And Mark Wahlberg, if I'm not mistaken. I have not seen the film.
Ice Cube.
Oh, Ice Cube's in it too?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Wonderful. I'm looking forward to watching it. Like I said, I haven't seen it. I am going to try to get the questions out as soon as possible, although we are in our last 5 weeks of our super heavy duty busy tour season. I've got 4th grade classes running around the museum every single day, sometimes up to 10 different groups. The education team is just absolutely exhausted at the end of every day, much less at the end of the week. I was wondering how I was going to get through this tonight. 20-minute nap and some coffee really helped. That was good. But I will try to get those questions out as soon as possible. And Chris, I don't know why you didn't get the questions this time, but I will absolutely make sure that you get them one way or another next time.
Email or send it by postal mail or whatever.
Carrier pigeon. But thank you all for joining me tonight. I always love talking about films. George, you were a fantastic addition tonight. I hope you.
Yes.
Well, I just have to say thanks as sort of a first-time guest. I appreciate your cordial welcoming of me. I enjoyed the discussion, and it really allowed me to review a film, which I think is a great one. So thank you.
Great,
Thank
great
you.
insight, great comments. You know, and I think that's what makes our little group here, you know, so special, is that we really do kind of, you know, I don't want to say we take this seriously, but this is something that we really enjoy. You know,
Yes.
we're just not marking time or just, you know, checking the box. We really like to talk about films, and we don't always
do.
agree, but that's not the point.
Yeah.
Come back,
as a matter of
George.
fact, we get better discussion when we don't agree, because we start to see different sides.
I think that's part of the plus of it, is that we all are okay with putting out how we truly feel, and we do
Yes.
we do it in a civil way, and
Yes,
I appreciate that.
me too. And Eric, I have to tell you, everyone I know who saw the Banshees of Inisherin, whatever it is, hated it. So I'll see it next week or the week after. So I'm looking forward to commenting to you on that.
You will be a little shocked in part, and I would highly recommend having a box of tissue with you at the end of the film.
Oh, and I
Really?
appreciate that nobody chose one of the girls in the hotel room as their favorite actor.
I almost did. I almost did.
I was
I
like,
gotta admit.
okay, is somebody gonna try that?
Ah,
Just, you know, like you say, Lisa, just to think outside of the box and try to find something new. And I was sitting there
oh,
today
that's
as I was
hysterical. I love
walking
it.
my last tour out the door, and I'm like, oh, I could choose. And I can't remember her name. She was the one who didn't talk very much with the long hair. She's been in quite a number of films and television shows as well. And I was like, I could choose her. I'm like, no, that's kind of cheap.
I was holding my breath. I was like, okay, guys.
All right, well, I look forward to seeing everybody next month. Maybe some
Yep.
of you sooner if you're going to join us for trivia or some of our upcoming book talks. But like I said, at the very least, I hope to see everybody back next month for Three Kings.
Okay.
So look forward to that, and I look forward to discussing questions coming out. Like I said, I'll get them out as soon as possible, I promise.
Don't worry about it.
I'm not, but still, I want to get them out there.